also want to thank the Center for Ethics and Society for the great honor of inviting me to give the Wesson lecture today on one of my favorite topics, which is the state of modern democracy. It's a little bit of a departure for me because I normally don't talk about American politics. My concern has been with democratic systems worldwide. But in a certain sense, I came to this issue because I do think that there is a bit of a crisis of democracy around the world. Although democracies have expanded tremendously in what Samuel Huntington called the third wave of democratization, I think we all recognize that many democracies, beginning with Europe, the European Union, and the United States, have not been performing up to their citizens' expectations, and many of the would-be democratic transitions in the Arab Spring, in Ukraine, and other places have not been going well. And it does seem to me that the fate of democracy worldwide is very much connected with how it operates in the most advanced democracies, and particularly in the United States. And so that is what brought me to this general topic that is addressed at much greater length in the book that Scott mentioned, Political Order and Political Decay. The actual title of the lecture, A State of Courts and Parties, comes from a book called Building the New American State by Stephen Skowronek, who wrote a history of state building in the US in the progressive era in the 19th and early 20th centuries. He argued that 19th century American government was what he called a state of courts and parties, meaning that it had government by the judiciary and the legislature with a highly underdeveloped executive branch compared to the modern bureaucracies that were being put together at that time in Europe. But then this began to change as the American state, the administrative state, expanded in the progressive era and the New Deal. And today we think of the United States as having this enormous, in fact, oversized, too large administrative state. But what I'm going to try to argue to you this evening is that we are, in a certain sense, still living in a political system that is a state of courts and parties in which the judiciary and legislature play roles, more important roles in many respects than a still quite dysfunctional executive branch. And many of the dysfunctions of American government stem from that source. Now, I need to begin with a little context setting and some definitions. In my view, a modern liberal democracy consists of three separate institutions, and these institutions exist in a certain amount of tension with one another. First of those institutions is the state. I like Max Weber's definition of the state, legitimate monopoly of force over territory. A state is really about power. It is about the ability to concentrate and deploy power to enforce the law, to defend the country against foreign enemies, to provide internal security, to provide services, to build infrastructure, all of the kinds of public goods that people expect from government. But it is basically about power, and underlying power is the ultimate threat of coercion. Second important institution is the rule of law. Now, you can have rule by law, in which law is simply the commands of the executive, but a true rule of law is a constraint on government. That is to say, it is not the rule of law unless the most powerful political actors in the system obey the law. So if the king or the prime minister or the president can make the rules up as they go along, that is not the rule of law. And so the state and the rule of law are already in tension with one another, because one is about using power, concentrating and using power, and the other is about constraining power. Final important part of this tripod is accountability, which today in the West we understand in procedural terms as free and fair multi-party elections. But the purpose of these procedures is to guarantee substantive accountability, meaning that the government ought to respond to the interests of the whole community and not simply to the self-interest, the narrow self-interest of the people who run the government. That's why we want democracy finally. So a modern liberal democracy is, on the one hand, a power concentrating institution, the state, and then two sets of institutions that constrain power, the rule of law and democratic accountability. And those cannot be simultaneously maximized. And part of the problem of modern government is actually to find the appropriate balance, because if you have too much of one or the other, you're not going to have a good situation. So, for example, I argued in the first volume of this series that China was the first global society to ever develop a modern, in Max Weber's sense, a modern state. They did this about 2,300 years ago at the time of the Qin unification. It's what they were good at then and what they're still good at in the year 2015. What they've never developed are the constraining institutions, either a rule of law or democratic accountability, and as a result, they run a dictatorship. On the other hand, if you look around the world today, you see places like Syria, Yemen, Libya, in which, well, actually you don't have much of any kind of institution, but certainly the thing that I think they miss the most acutely is actually the state with that monopoly of force. Rather, you get a situation where anybody with an AK-47 can put together a militia, and it's not very pleasant living in that kind of society. And so the institution of power has to coexist with the institutions of constraint. Now, there's a further important distinction, which is between, on the one hand, what, again, Weber called a patrimonial or a neo-patrimonial state and a modern state. So a patrimonial state is one in which the state and its machinery is regarded as patrimony, as the personal property of the people that run the state. And so in the old days when you had kings and queens, you know, the king could give away a province to a daughter as a wedding present because he literally owned the territory and all the people that lived on it. So today we don't have anybody that dares to claim in this fashion that they own the state. They have you know, elections and presidents and bureaucracies and so forth. But in many countries, particularly in the developing world, the reality of politics is, in fact, patrimonialism. So political scientists have labeled this neo-patrimonialism, where you have the outward form of a modern state, but the reality is that the people running the state are doing it for their own private economic benefit. A modern state is different from this. A modern state seeks to be impersonal, meaning that your relationship to the state does not depend on your personal connection or your family connections to the rulers. It depends on your status as citizen, and a modern state seeks to serve something called a public interest rather than the private interest of the rulers. And therefore, only in a modern state can you have a phenomenon like corruption. Corruption is where you misappropriate public money for private purposes, and obviously, unless there's a basic distinction between public and private, you can't even have, I mean, it wouldn't make sense to speak of corruption in a, you know, in an old patrimonial monarchy. Now, the fundamental argument that I make in the course of this last book is that of these three pillars, in a way, the easiest of them to construct is the democratic pillar. It is relatively easy to build institutions like multi-party elections, relatively free and fair. We did this more or less, or at least created election-like events in Afghanistan and Iraq and difficult places like that. It is much, much harder to make the shift from a patrimonial or a neo-patrimonial state to a modern state, and that's been the big failure, and this is one of the big failures of democracy globally. So if you think about what's gone wrong in Ukraine they had an Orange Revolution where they pushed out Viktor Yanukovych in 2004, but the new democratic, you know, quote-unquote democratic government could not govern. They themselves were highly corrupt. They were constantly bickering. And they didn't do anything about the pervasive corruption in Ukraine. And as a result, Yanukovych was reelected in 2010, and they had to start all over again with the Euromaidan protest. And that's really the fundamental issue between, you know, the West, the European Union, the United States on the one hand, and people like Yanukovych or Vladimir Putin in Russia, that in the EU, and that's why the young Ukrainians want to align with the EU, because they want to live in a modern society, or they want to live under a modern state in which public interest is well defined and not in a kleptocracy. The issue is much less democracy, because in fact I think Putin would probably win an election by a pretty large majority if it came to that. And so in many places around the world, it is actually the weakness of that first pillar, this inability to get to a modern state that I think is the Achilles heel of democracy. And it's true in many existing democracies. So in India, for example, there's a study by Jean Drèze, the economist and activist in the late 1990s, of some poor states in the north of India, where he found that 50% of school teachers in elementary schools were getting paid, but they weren't showing up for their jobs. And this caused a great deal of outrage. India is a democratic country. It's got a powerful free press, opposition parties. Nobody liked this fact. 10 years later, they did another survey after repeated efforts to reform the education system, and they found exactly the same percentage of teachers weren't showing up for work. And so this, I think, indicates the kind of problem or the failure of governments, democratic governments, to deliver on the basic things that people want government for. People do not want government simply to constrain power. They want governments that can use and deploy power to provide public goods, services, and the like. And this is why, in many ways, my book is an extension of Samuel Huntington's famous 1968 book, Political Order in Changing Societies. And he said the following in the first chapter of that book. He said, "When an American thinks about the problem of government building, he directs himself not to the problem of the creation of authority and the accumulation of power, but rather to the limitation of authority and the division of power." And I think that particularly Americans tend to be blind to this problem of the need for effective and legitimate exercise of authority and political power. We think about the institutions of constraint first and foremost, but we don't actually think about the actual delivery of governance. And you could see this unfolding in our occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan. So this now brings me to the American part of the lecture, because, as I said, I think that the weakness in the administrative state, in the state's ability to deliver basic services, although we are head and shoulders above other countries, and in fact, some parts of our government are the best, absolutely the best anywhere in the world, I believe that we've got a general problem, and that this characterization of American government as a government of courts and parties continues to be true. We have an overdeveloped judiciary and an overly intrusive legislature and an underdeveloped executive. Now, I need to step back a little bit and run through the history of the development of the American state because it illustrates an important point. There has always been a tension in the United States between the principle of democracy, which is popular participation, and the principle of good government, which is expertise, meritocracy, impersonality. Those two things can be made to go together, and in a well-run polity, they do go together, but there is also a certain degree of tension, and I think that tension becomes evident when you look at American history. If you look at the American government, it wasn't very large in the immediate aftermath of the American Revolution, and it was characterized by some historians as basically the friends of George Washington, meaning that the government was run by the elite in the colonial era. A lot of them were graduates of Harvard and Yale, elite institutions. This began to break down by the 1820s as different American states expanded the franchise. As I'm sure you're aware, the United States was really the first country to open up the franchise to all white males. This happened in most American states by the end of the 1820s. And a critical moment in American history was the election of 1828 that brought Andrew Jackson to power. Andrew Jackson was a populist, and he set in a way, the tradition of American populism because he was the beneficiary of this expanded franchise. He ran against John Quincy Adams. John Quincy Adams was a classical Boston Brahmin. He went to Harvard University. He traveled in Europe. He could speak foreign languages and came from that northeastern elite. Andrew Jackson was a frontiersman, a brawler, a drinker, an Indian fighter. He made his name in the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, and he ran against Adams on the grounds that we don't need to be ruled by these elites, that we Americans, ought to elect somebody that talks and acts much more like us, and that was what the Jacksonian Revolution was. He comes to power in that election, and he says two things. At first, I won the election, so I should appoint who runs the American government. And second, he didn't put it in quite these terms, but in effect he said, any fool can be a federal bureaucrat. And so this begins a 100-year period in American history known as the spoils system or the patronage system. And by the time of the Civil War, virtually every government office, from the federal government down to your local fourth-class postmaster, was there as a result of a payoff by a politician to some political supporters. So Americans invented what political scientists now label clientelism. That is this trading of government offices and other perks for votes. And a lot of Americans, look down at India or Brazil or Mexico or other developing countries that practice this kind of politics. But I would say that first of all, they don't understand their own history, and they don't understand the dynamic, because I think that clientelism, rather than being understood as simply a deviation from good government and a form of corruption, ought to be understood as an early form of democratic participation. If you want to get people to the polling place in a society with relatively low levels of income and education, it is much easier to motivate people by giving them a job in the post office or a Christmas turkey than it is to promise them, some complex policy, on global warming or, how to deal with the Syrian civil war or whatnot. I mean, people want these concrete individual benefits, and that's why the United States was a pioneer in the creation of this vast clientelistic system. This lasts really up until the 1880s. At this moment, America has ceased to be an agrarian, largely rural society. It is industrializing. The internet of those days was really the railroads, which were knitting the country together in a continental system of integrated markets. The country was urbanizing, turning from a largely agrarian society where people lived on family farms to an urban industrial one, and it needed a different form of government. It needed a much more effective system of national regulation, of more uniformity in promoting commerce and the like. But the old system was very tenacious, because I think, this is a point that Doug North and Barry Weingast make in their book, Violence and Social Orders. The reason that you have these dysfunctional political systems, clientelistic or patronage or corrupt political systems, it's not because people don't understand what a good system looks like. It's because they've got a big self-interest in keeping that old system the way it is. And that was the case in the 1880s. Every single member of Congress had been elected on the basis of patronage. They had no interest in changing the system. The reason the system changed was two things. The first was the rise of a new middle class in the United States. Urban merchants, progressive reformers, trade associations, the like, that actually wanted higher quality, less corrupt government. And secondly, there was an external triggering event, which was the assassination of James Garfield. He was elected in 1882. He was shot by a fellow named Guiteau, a would-be office seeker. It took 6 very painful weeks for him to die. And Congress was basically so embarrassed by this, the fact that the patronage system had led to the assassination of a president, that they voted for something called the Pendleton Act in 1883, which really established the first modern American bureaucracy. meaning that you would be hired on the basis of merit, on the basis of a civil service examination, and not on the basis of political patronage. But because the American system, with its checks and balances, cannot act very decisively, it then took the next 40 years approximately for this system to spread, and it really doesn't get to the point where as many as 80–90% of federal employees are classified employees until the time of the New Deal. And so it's a very, very slow process putting a modern administrative state in place in the United States. All right, so that's the historical background, which brings us to the last couple of generations. And I would argue that, in fact, we are in a big crisis, and that since high point that you would measure sometime probably in the 1950s, there has been a very serious deterioration in the quality of American government. So, for example, I mean, and there's a fair amount of evidence for this. You have a couple of Volcker Commission reports that were done in the 1980s and then in the early 2000s. In the introduction to the second of those reports, Volcker says, "Those who enter the civil service often find themselves trapped in a maze of rules and regulations that thwart their personal development and stifle creativity. The best are underpaid, the worst overpaid." The government actually surveys federal workers every year in a survey called FedView, and the numbers have been declining steadily in terms of qualifications and all the Weberian characteristics of bureaucracy. So in a recent survey, only 9% of those federal workers surveyed said that disciplining poor performance in their agency was good, whereas 67% said that it was either not very good or not good at all. 50% of all workers, new federal workers, over the last 10 years have been veterans because Congress enacted a veterans preference. So in the 19th century, in the patronage system, you would get a job in the federal government because of a personal payoff to a political boss. We don't have that system. That kind of individualized corruption does not exist, but the politicization of hiring rules has crept back into the system. So 50% are veterans, and of those 50%, another 50% are disabled veterans. You can understand perfectly well why Congress did this, but you try to imagine if they imposed a similar mandate on Google that said that 50% of all of their employees had to be veterans. They wouldn't be very happy, and they would not be able to recruit the best and the brightest. There's a recent book by John DiIulio at Penn called Bring Back the Bureaucrats, which I think is really mind-blowing in some of the empirical data that it presents. DiIulio points out that because of the anti-statist political culture in the United States, the one thing that both parties agree on is that they hate federal bureaucrats. And so there has been a hard cap on the number of federal employees ever since the 1960s. And so today, in 2015, there are about 1.8 million federal workers, which is a slightly lower number than the total number of federal workers that the government employed in the year 1960. In the meantime, the amount of money that is funneled through the federal government has increased fivefold. So the same number of people are managing 5 times the amount of money. The administrative specialist Don Kettle points out that Medicare and Medicaid constitute 20% of the federal budget, and they are administered by a workforce that constitutes 0.02% of the federal workforce. So you want the administrators of Medicare to crack down on Medicare fraud. You're calling on a body of workers that is a fraction of the size relative to the amount of money being handed out than it was 2 generations ago. And I think that this is one of the reasons that you get these big disasters that have happened in the last decade. For example, the administration of the occupation of Iraq, which was one that I was intimately familiar with and which was bungled from the start. But there, unfortunately, are many others. The rollout of healthcare.gov, unfortunately, this was not an isolated phenomenon. The federal government cannot procure large IT systems. And so you had a similar failure in the FBI and in many other big federal agencies. The US Army wasted about $10 billion building a future combat systems procurement project over the past decade, and it produced zero. It produced zero. And then the latest scandal in the Veterans Administration, which I'm sure you're all familiar with. So these are some of the evidence for problems. And the question is then, why are Americans getting this low-quality government? What are the deeper sources of this? And here I would say that the story is a complex one that is rooted both in changes in the nature of American society, but also in the unique characteristics of American democratic institutions. And independently, these would not produce, I think, a crisis of governance, but I think in combination they have. So the societal part, or the structural part of the story, has to do with a couple of things. So first, one of them is the rise of polarization. So this is one area where political scientists are really pretty good. So if you look at something like the DW nominate metric that measures the degree of the ideological positioning of politicians, it's very clear that for most of the 20th century, the two political parties overlapped very, very substantially. And all of the big legislative acts, the New Deal, the Great Society, the Reagan Revolution, were the product of the fact that you could create a centrist coalition of Republicans and Democrats to pass major pieces of legislation. Since the late 1990s, that overlap has virtually disappeared, so that the most liberal Republican is now considerably more conservative than the most conservative Democrat. And this is manifesting itself in residential patterns, so that Americans are physically segregating themselves. They care more about ideology and these kinds of political affiliations than they do about ethnicity or religion. They'd rather have their, kid marry a Muslim than marry a Republican if you're, something equivalent. And it's quite a remarkable sorting of American society that has happened. The second, I think, phenomenon, which is partly social and partly institutional, is the rise of very well-organized and well-resourced interest groups. So American liberalism had evolved into what political scientists call interest group liberalism by the 1960s, but it has, and the theory of James Madison in Federalist 10 was that it shouldn't matter. It shouldn't matter because in a large country that's very diverse, in many respects, geographically, ideologically, and so forth, that interest groups would cancel each other out, and basically none of them would get big enough to tyrannize over the rest of the society. That is largely true, but there's another side that Madison didn't address equally well, which was the need, the periodic and actually frequent need for collective action, where it's not enough simply to be able to block the government from doing something. It's also necessary at times to aggregate interests to get the government to decide to do things. This is the point at which these social phenomena then intersect with the institutional structure of the American government. If you look across all developed democracies, the United States is an outlier in terms of what, again, political scientists labeled veto points or veto players. So in the American Constitution, the American Founding Fathers had one overriding concern, which was to prevent tyranny. They were highly distrustful of centralized government, and they created a system of checks and balances that spread power out and allowed different parts of the American system to check one another. So you have a very powerful upper house, which many European democracies do not have. You've got a separate judiciary that has a right of judicial review. You have devolution to state and local governments. And then beyond these things that are in the Constitution, you've had this spread of other kinds of veto points. So in the current institutional setup, any one of 100 senators can veto any given executive branch appointments. So I believe that at the current moment, there's a backlog of something like 60 ambassadorial appointments that have been sitting in the Senate because some individual senator has put a hold on it. And again, I ask you to imagine what it would be like to run Google if their board of directors had 100 members and every one of those members could veto a mid-level managerial appointment on the part of the senior management of the country. You have other things, the filibuster. I mean, there are other accretions of veto points. And when you put these two together, that's, I think, where you get the current paralysis and deadlock. So in a parliamentary system, parties are polarized and very ideological, and there's a lot of party discipline. But it's a parliamentary system, and so you can create coalitions and the like. But when you marry that kind of polarization and these very powerfully organized interest groups up with this check and balance American system, what you get is what I labeled a vetocracy, meaning rule by veto, in which a lot of individual points in the system are strong enough to stop collective action on the part of the whole, but they are not strong enough to actually produce positive results. And you have a lot of examples of this happening. We haven't passed a budget, according to Congress's own rules, since 2008. If you look at the American tax code, I think it is a disgrace because it is full of privileges, essentially negotiated by individual interest groups to create a subsidy or a tax exemption. And there's a critical distinction between liberties and privileges. A liberty is freedom from government action that applies to all citizens impartially. A privilege is something that applies just to me or my family or my company. And the American tax code is a system of privileges. Now, I'm going to get into the courts and parties thing because this is an important aspect, I think, of the dysfunction. So let's begin with the judicialization of many functions that in a European parliamentary democracy would be carried out by an executive branch agency. A lot of this occurs because of American history and because of the nature of American federalism. So in a parliamentary system, if you wanted to, for example, legalize gay marriage or abortion or rights for ethnic minorities or religious minorities, the legislature would pass a law and then the National Justice Ministry would simply implement the law. That's not how social change happened in the United States. It didn't happen because in the civil rights era, local governments were controlled by segregationist forces in the South, and you could not rely on the government. First of all, Congress could not act because of the veto by the bloc of southern states that was sufficient to stop civil rights legislation up until the 1960s, and local governments, were pro-segregation. So Brown versus Board of Education, this landmark decision, was brought by a private party, the NAACP, against the local school board rather than by Congress acting through democratic institutions. Now, the big legislation in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act and the Civil Rights Act, were legislative acts, but this set the precedent for important social legislation not to come about as a result of legislative action, but through the courts. There was about 12 or 13 major pieces of social legislation passed in the late 60s and early 1970s in environmental protection, occupational safety and health, equal employment opportunity, and the like. And Congress, because of this distrust of executive branch authority, expanded standing, meaning who has the right to sue the government, to include very, very many people, oftentimes only marginally impacted by a particular government action. So in other words, rather than relying on the executive branch to enforce rules established by the legislature, we in the United States rely on private citizens to sue the government, either to enforce a rule or to desist from enforcing a rule. In fact, we have a worse version of it here in California. There's a private Attorney General's Act that actually expands standing beyond federal standing. So it's very, very easy to sue the government as a private individual here in the state of California. And this leads to some very I think, odd results. I'll just give you one little anecdote. I used to live in McLean, Virginia, in Fairfax County, a very wealthy suburb of Washington, D.C. In our neighborhood, in the suburbs, there would be sidewalks in front of maybe 50% of the houses, and then the sidewalk would disappear and the lawn would just go straight out to the street. So one day, Fairfax County comes along and they install wheelchair ramps in all of the parts of the, the suburb that actually had sidewalks, which, if you think about it, makes no sense whatsoever, because if you're in a wheelchair, you go for a block and then sidewalk ends and you have to go out into the street and then get back on the sidewalk and so forth. So why did Fairfax County do this? It makes no sense. It's a very well-run county. I'm sure that there are many things that they would much rather spend their money doing. The reason they did was that the Americans with Disabilities Act was a very poorly written piece of legislation. It created a broad mandate to remedy disabilities through things like wheelchair ramps, with no offsetting considerations of budget or other kinds of social goods that might be, at whose expense this kind of action might come. And because there are individuals like a fellow named Theodore Pinnock in a little town called Julian, California, who sued about 250 local businesses for not installing wheelchair ramps, I suspect the county government was very afraid of this kind of litigation. And so they end up doing something that, from a discretionary point of view, makes no sense whatsoever. So this is what the legal scholar Robert Kagan has called adversarial legalism, and a lot of our public administration is of this nature, done through the courts rather than through the executive branch. The more troubling part of the courts and parties story, though, I think, is Congress, because that's the avenue through which these highly organized and well-funded interest groups operate. And here again, I think the problem with the Madisonian theory is that it didn't take account of the impact of organization, money, media on the ability to amplify the political power of certain groups over others in such a way that the collectivity of well-organized interest groups, all the K Street lobbyists in Washington, is in the end not representative of the whole American people. It overrepresents the people that can organize the best, whether those are Wall Street banks or public sector unions. They exist both on the left and the right. And the reason that this affects the quality of government is that it very much affects the way in which authority is handed off from Congress to the executive branch. We do a very bad job of this, compared, I think, again, to a lot of parliamentary systems, because we locate a lot of that executive action in Congress itself, beginning with something like budget authority, which in our system is entirely within the purview of Congress and not, as in a Westminster system, a function of the executive. This, I think, results in, in very poor quality legislation. So again, to take some recent examples, two big legislative acts of the Obama administration are the Affordable Care Act and the Dodd-Frank bill regulating the financial sector. I personally am very much in favor of both of these bills. I think we need a universal health care system, and we desperately need a regulation of large financial institutions. But these two pieces of legislation are really atrocious as legislation. I mean, they are hundreds of pages long. They contain many, many provisions that none of the members of Congress voting for them have ever read. We are going to be tied up in litigation over them for the next generation, if not longer. And a lot of this, I think, is directly the product of interest groups, well-organized interest groups, who actually wrote most of the legislation in both of these bills, operating through members of Congress, which they are able to influence through money. And so this is what I label political decay. The American Republic is not in danger of collapsing. it's actually doing pretty well. And in fact, we are the only developed country really that is actually growing pretty vigorously now, and we should all be happy about this because we've got a very vigorous private sector. So I do not believe that American civilization is in decline. You know, we still have a lot of entrepreneurship and energy and so forth. But American government, I believe, has decayed, and it has become very dysfunctional in its ability to carry out many of its basic functions. And I think that, you know, it's in many ways a specifically American disease, because I think on a national level, there are other democracies I can think of that have actually been much more effective at governing their societies over the past 10 to 15 years. So I don't buy the idea that all, you know, there are stresses that all democracies face, but I don't buy the idea that everybody is uniformly declining at the same rate. In the Q&A, we can possibly talk about some solutions to this. The book that I wrote was not intended to be a policy book. Actually, at the Center on Democracy Development and the Rule of Law, we have an American Politics in Comparative Perspective project in which we're actually trying to come up with some very concrete ideas of how you can change institutions to fix some of these problems. And if you're interested, I can talk about some of those. But I would just conclude by taking this American story back to the international level. Because, as I said at the beginning, the success of democracy in the oldest and most developed democracy in the world matters a great deal for the prestige and the success of democracy in other parts of the world. And right now, I think we've got a big problem because neither Europe nor the United States looks like a model. I mean, and I see this in students and, you know, non-Americans that I talk to who are otherwise well-inclined towards the United States, but very few, you know, so I think right after the fall of the Berlin Wall, many of them, you know, from China or Hungary or, you know, other countries would have said, yes, we want to be like the United States. And I think relatively few people today would say, yes, we would like to have the partisan gridlock and partisan bickering that we see in Washington, D.C. We want that for our country. So I think that if the United States does not address some of these issues and reform its own system, I think that that is not going to be good for the international system as a whole. So thank you very much for your attention, and I really look forward, I really appreciate Professors Levy and Katz-Nelson for your willingness to be commentators. I'm really looking forward to what you have to say in the session tomorrow afternoon. So thank you very much.
And comments, if you could raise your hand, and I ask that you identify yourself first, and then you put your question in the form of a question, even if that means at the end of your statement that you say, isn't that correct? If you wait for the microphone, right in the middle there, can you? Gentleman? Yes, gentleman in the blue check shirt.
Hi, my name is Vivek Viswanathan. I'm a recent graduate of the Law and Business School here at Stanford. Really enjoyed your lecture. You had mentioned how the triggers in the 1880s were the rise of a middle class and the assassination of the president. I'm curious what you think, you know, whatever the ideal solution may be, what would be the triggers today?
Well, that's a very good question. So I have been relatively pessimistic that anything on the horizon is going to knock us off of our, you know, the current equilibrium that we're at. And so you need a triggering event. And you could imagine, you know, several different ones, like a really big financial crisis. Now, I had sort of thought that the one that we had experienced in 2007-8 was a pretty big crisis, but it turned out that the policymakers acted quickly enough that they put a floor under the, you know, the downturn. And now, you know, it's as if, what crisis, you know, in terms of, you know, the position, you know, the banks are now more concentrated than they were prior to the crisis, despite the fact that it was those large banks that had really been heavily responsible for it in the first place and so forth. And so it could be an external event like this. It could be social change. And that could happen. I mean, there are lots of things that could happen that we're just not, we're only very dimly aware of until after the fact. But right now, I don't see a candidate, I don't see an agenda, I don't see a mass mobilization out there that is likely to push, for the kind of reform that I think is necessary.
In the middle and the back.
Thank you. My name is Greg Slater. I disagree, or no, I think that you need to add, or I'd like to know if you will be willing to admit that you need to add the extreme asymmetry in the development of this gridlock or whatever, in the sense that look at who is blocking what sensible people, and I will say that, believe has to be done, whether it's from climate change, whether it's immigration policy, whether it's reform of banks, whether it's the ever-increasing consolidation of wealth at the top, which fuels a corrupt government, a government that is not democratic in the sense that the wealthy both dictate, choose the legislators who can be voted for, and therefore the ones who, we're given a choice between two people who are chosen by the elite because they give the money. All of this is due to the repubs. I'll just say it. And it's the right that is moving that way. It's not, you don't see a bunch of Marxists rising to power. To call Obama a leftist is absurd. I mean, he sucked up to the banks, all this stuff. So, I mean, it's really not fair to call this a symmetric evolution toward this gridlock system.
I think this may be the period in the sentence, and then the question is, do you agree with that?
I think, how can you not agree with that?
And can you explain why, please?
So,
The other question?
I agree. So I have not liked the evolution of the modern Republican Party and the rise of the Tea Party. I think that they, represent a really extremist, view of the role of government that is completely unrealistic. And I think you're right that, this idea that you'd shut down the American government because you couldn't get a majority to repeal Obamacare was just, an absurd position. So, yes, I understand the force of that. However, we've got a problem that preceded the Tea Party and that will survive the demise of the Tea Party. And this is what I actually tell a lot of my conservative friends. So these checks and balances were originally put in place to prevent the growth of big government. And in many respects, it slowed down the growth of the American welfare state compared to other democracies. And so it did that. It also slowed down civil rights legislation and a lot of other things. But it is also going to slow down entitlement reform. So you think about a future, we don't need to do entitlement reform today. In fact, I think that would probably be dangerous because the deficit is really not growing that fast at the present moment, but we will need to do it in another 10, 15 years as the baby boom gets older. And you just think, the amount of pain that's going to be distributed through tax increases and benefit cuts when that time comes. In our vetocratic system, it is very hard to imagine how that's going to work. So I take your point. I want to remain a little bit nonpartisan. I think that, I would say, yeah, probably a majority of the recent problems are more driven by the Republicans than the Democrats, but Democrats have their own, interest groups as well. One of the reasons we can't have a new Pendleton Act, I think, is really because of the power of a lot of public sector unions, which introduce a lot of, rigidity and dysfunctions in the way the government operates.
Right here in the front.
Valeria Karableva, Kyiv University, Ukraine, and a visiting scholar here. My question concerns the overlap between internal and international dimensions. What you are saying about the constraints of power, which is very good working internally because of improving the democracy, but it can produce a kind of image of a weak state.
Yes.
And what do you think about all these whistleblowers and Edward Snowden scandals? So which is the best policy, to reveal all the secrets to improve the democracy or to save the image of a strong state worldwide?
So I have to make clear that the correct policy is very context dependent. So in general, I think most governments, and particularly most governments in transitional and developing countries, don't have nearly enough transparency. They need more whistleblowers, they need more accountability. This is fundamental to getting their governments to work better. And I think in our government, we also need whistleblowers. I actually think that, unlike Julian Assange, who I thought was just a jerk, that Snowden actually, did a very important thing. I mean, he did reveal some really important things that were going on, that Congress was not, monitoring adequately, and that we need more transparency in that whole, security intelligence realm. At the same time, there are other respects in which we have too much transparency, and in fact, CDDRL, we're probably going to have a little workshop on this about the limits of transparency this spring, because if you ask why is it that Congress no longer deliberates about anything, I think the fundamental answer is that they are on C-SPAN 24/7. And so they never have a protected space in which to talk to each other directly because they are always worried about being quoted out of context that gets to an activist audience, somewhere out there in TV land. In general, a lot of the efforts to make government more transparent and accountable, and also in terms of participation, have had these effects of actually increasing the scope for well-organized interests to be the people that really call the shots. So it's complex. Even in the same government, you may need simultaneously more transparency and less transparency.
Gentleman here on the left.
Hello, I'm David Shayer. I've read a theory that demographic shifts in America are leading to millennial population moving up into the voting age, more immigrants, more Hispanics who all lean Democratic, whereas the Republican base is older, dying off, and also the Republican base keeps pulling them towards policies that really piss off the younger millennials and the immigrants. Mm-hmm. And I'm wondering if you believe this theory that is going to lead to more Democrats in a generation, or if you think that we're going to look back on this in 10 years just like we look back on Karl Rove's statements that the Republicans were going to run Washington for a generation and just wonder how we could have believed something so silly.
I think that the basic demographic story is probably true, but I don't think it's going to be reflected in actual American politics anytime soon because of our vetocratic system. So, for example, given the kind of gerrymandering that goes on in the House, up until this latest election, the Democrats have actually won majorities, if you count votes across all House elections for the last several, but the Republicans still had a majority because of the way the thing was districted. And then, the larger story of vetocracy is the Republicans can become a permanent minority party, and they will still be able to stop stuff, for many, many years to come. That's the story that actually Professor Katznelson, tells about the Southern Democrats, who are a key part of the New Deal coalition. So why is it that it took 100 years from the end of the Civil War and the passage of the 14th Amendment to finally get to equal civil rights and voting rights? And it's largely because a minority of southern states were able to block action at a national level. And so I think, yeah, these demographic changes are probably going to happen, but it may result in, very, very slow change in the actual political outcomes.
Question right here in the middle.
Thank you. Mickey Winkler. I would like you to compare a parliamentary versus a party system such as we have and talk about the efficacy of each. Thank you.
So I don't want to make the argument that all parliamentary systems are great. Greece has a parliamentary system, and it's not been functioning very well. Italy has a parliamentary system, right? So there are many poorly functioning parliamentary systems. But let me just give you a very straightforward example about budgeting. So in most Commonwealth countries with a Westminster system, the budget is actually written in the government. The Treasury writes the budget with guidance from the cabinet. So this is true in Britain, in Australia, in Canada, in New Zealand, and so forth. The budget is then presented to Parliament in a single up or down vote, and in Britain, after the presentation of the budget, it takes about a week, and Parliament passes the budget. So in our system, OMB may propose a budget, as it's about to do in February, but then it's basically Congress and the 535 members of Congress that then make the actual budget, and it takes 6 months. And this is part of the reason why lobbyists are so much more prevalent and influential in the American system than in a Westminster system, because every one of those 535 members is an access point for a lobbyist. And so, you've actually had pretty good government in a lot of these, in Germany and Scandinavia and many of the Commonwealth countries. They've gotten control of budget deficits. They've taken very painful measures to liberalize their labor markets, like in Agenda 2010 in Germany or in Denmark and so forth. And I think they're largely able to do this because the executive branch actually plays a bigger role in the formulation of legislation. You cannot do this in our presidential system. So the one lesson I do not want you to take away from what I said is, oh yes, we've got this very problematic, Congress court-centered system. The solution is to strengthen the executive branch. The problem with our divided power system is it doesn't work that way. I mean, can you imagine Mitch McConnell and John Boehner's reaction if you said, yes, the solution to the problem of Congress making budgets is to let Obama have more executive authority? It doesn't work because, the two branches can be and are held by different parties. And so this is why I think a lot of these problems are very, very deeply embedded in our presidential system.
Hi, my name is Cameron Dehart, and I was curious what role independent central bankers play in this story. So we've seen in the past 30 years, and especially since the financial crisis, we see these unelected but supposedly expert economists and bankers handling a pretty big part of public policy, and that is aggregate demand management. So I'm curious maybe what your thoughts are. That seems to be a policy area where we are moving towards experts and not towards politicians.
I actually like the Fed. And I think that the move towards independent central banks, broadly has been a good one, because I think that you cannot get, high-quality governance unless you're willing to delegate a fair amount of, authority. But it has to be delegated to a body that is trustworthy and is capable of exercising that authority, appropriately. I think that while you can second guess, many of the recent decisions of both Greenspan and Bernanke, on the whole, they did a reasonable job given the information they had, and the exercise of discretionary authority that Bernanke exercised during the crisis was just astonishing. I mean, this was a bank that would let, multi-billion-dollar financial institutions live or die based on a decision made by a small committee, in a period of 24 hours. And they, by and large, exercise that authority pretty responsibly. And one of the big weaknesses of the EU is that the European Central Bank doesn't have nearly the authority and the discretion that the Fed has. And I think they're not going to get out of their current crisis unless they fix that.
Let me ask a final question before we close. Much of the blame or the responsibility for the problems that you're discussing fall, in your analysis, on the Congress. And the public, in one way, seems to agree with this. If you look at polling on measures of respect or measures of confidence, Congress is right down there at the bottom. And yet, if you look at re-election trends, Congress see high incumbency rates of getting reelected, and I've seen some polls suggesting that if you just ask point blank, do you prefer to have split government or a united government, people claim they prefer a split government quite often. How do you explain this?
Well, I think it's a product of several things. So, in fact, Congress does respond to popular wishes pretty effectively. So what do people want? They want lots of benefits. They don't want to pay taxes, and they would, they're quite happy to borrow money in order to make those two things happen simultaneously, and that's actually what Congress has delivered to them very effectively. On an individual basis, they're going to be very happy with the particular project that the congressman has brought back, but then somewhere at the back of their minds, they do understand that collectively the system isn't, working terribly well, and that's why I think you get these extremely low polling numbers for Congress as an institution, although, their individual congressman is someone that's respected. On the question of do people actually like divided government, I'd say yes, there is polling data that suggests that Americans are happy with that. I think it's a very deep aspect of this is something that Marty Lipset, whom I had the pleasure of interacting with at quite some length, when I was at George Mason, used to argue that, American political culture is very anti-state, it's very distrustful of government, and therefore Americans would rather be prevented from, have the government prevented from doing something than, actually perform it. But I just think that can get, it can get carried too far.
Great. Well, thank you.